Hello, listeners, and welcome to Privacy Chats with Rachel and John, a podcast for privacy professionals and enthusiasts alike. I'm Rachel.
Hi, Rachel. I'm John. We are your hosts, and we're going to be sharing our perspective today on the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act, or probably people mostly refer to it as the EU AI Act. And before we get started, we have to have disclaimers because lawyers tell us we have to. So I just want to share that the information that we share throughout this episode is that of our own. It's not in any way affiliated with our employers or any other organizations. Rachel and I produce these episodes on our own time, and they're based on our own research and our own professional opinions.
Nice. Another way of saying that we're not getting paid for this. We're doing it out of the
We're
good of our
not
heart.
getting paid for it. And by saying that, we won't get in trouble with anyone.
So, John, we've talked a lot about GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU on this podcast. And we also did an episode a while back on DMA, so the Digital Markets Act, and DSA, the Digital Services Act, also in the EU. Today, we're talking about a new regulation in the EU, yet again, but this time about artificial intelligence. Why are we talking so much about regulations in the EU? And do you think that we have a lot of listeners in Europe? I wonder.
I wonder too. I would like to think so. Like I would like to think that there's listeners all over the world. So we'll just pretend that for now. But so yeah, I mean the EU is important to a lot of the work that we do. And kind of your question alludes to, you know, the crux of my answer. So really, my thought is that the European Union has become a trendsetter in the world of privacy protection. The GDPR that you referenced that we talked about before is in a lot of ways a template for other privacy regulations that have come since then around the world. Some that come particularly to mind are the CCPA that we did an episode on. There's an even more recent one from Brazil, the General Data Protection Law, or it's referred to as LGPD, which I assume means General Data Protection Law in a different
Yes,
language.
couldn't tell you exactly. You're right.
Right. But you know, and these laws are very similar to GDPR, so and you can see how GDPR implements them. So you know, as a trendsetter, I think it makes sense to focus on what's happening in Europe.
Right. And you're talking about this, replication kind of happening. Do you think the same thing will happen with other laws in Europe?
I think it's possible. Like there's with GDPR was the first, so there was kind of a void there that GDPR was able to fill, and I think the same is true with AI. And so they're really the first the new AI law that's out, and it makes sense when other laws are being created. It makes sense to look at the one that's already there and use it as a template and borrow from their success, and you know, yeah, see what you can do with it. So yeah, that makes sense.
Why reinvent the wheel, right?
Exactly, right.
So AI is a very prevalent topic today, but I'm curious where you got the inspiration to start talking about the EU AI Act today.
Yeah, so you and I have talked about IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Practitioners. We're both members. We have several certifications from them. You're getting ready to pursue another one,
A
which is
third,
great.
yes.
A third, yeah. So excited for you about that. But the IAPP recently had its Global Privacy Summit in Washington, D.C., which is fairly close to where I live. And I was able to attend that. It was my first time going to the IAPP Summit, which was great. I enjoyed it a lot. There was some really good keynote speakers. But then they have, in addition to the keynotes, there's like a ton of breakout sessions. And you know, I wish I could go to all of them, but you can't because there's so many going on at the same time. But in that, they had what they called, I think it was a comprehensive series of 7 different sessions back to back about this EU AI Act. So, you know, I decided to kind of focus my attention on that. I went to all 7 of those sessions. So I came out without getting to, you know, get into a lot of other things, but I did, you know, get a kind of a comprehensive look into this EU AI Act. So that was the inspiration. I recently attended that. I took a lot of notes, and I figured, hey, we should talk about it here.
Yeah, sounds like a great crash course, being that you have some of the professionals on the bleeding edge of either this regulation or actually implementing it into their programs. How do we get invited to this conference to represent our podcast? Did you get a sense of that?
I don't know how that works. They had a lot of speakers, but I think, you know, maybe if we keep talking about the IAPP, their own AI algorithm will hear us on the internet and they'll reach out to us and invite us to attend. I think their next big conference is in Brussels in November.
Yep.
So yeah. So if you're listening, IAPP, we would love to come.
We're here. We're here.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think the automated decision making you're getting to is a great segue to talk about the AI Act. So what's it all about? What's your TLDR here?
So I looked at, I mean, the place that makes sense to start is the European Parliament's website. So I looked there, and they have a posting about the AI Act that says on the top of it that the use of artificial that talks about the act and says the use of artificial intelligence in the EU will be regulated by the EU AI Act. And then it specifically says that it's the world's first comprehensive AI law. So that's kind of a good starting point for it.
Yeah, we're essentially filling that empty void. And if this is really the first AI law, which I can't say I've heard a lot of development happening outside of the EU to this extent, I could see how it might influence others. And, we would be seeing more EU AI acts, but replace EU with given jurisdiction, right? And taking inspiration from what started.
Yeah, and perhaps even throughout the country, as like we're starting to see different regulations in each state. I'm hoping that we don't have something like that. But yeah, so this regulation in the EU was first proposed by the European Commission in 2021. And it's been a couple of years, but I guess that's just the legislative process. So it's been working through the legislative process in Europe, which seems very complicated to me. There's so many different entities and boards and regulation agencies. I don't know. I think we've talked about it before, but
Yeah.
anyway, so they've been working on this for the last 3 years or so.
Well, I hope, bureaucratic, little hurdles aside, that we're pretty far along in actually seeing it go into implementation, correct?
Yeah, it seems that it is. So there was the final bill was approved by the European Parliament on March 13th. So what are we at the end of April, May now? So it's just about 2 months ago. But there's still like a final step. I don't fully understand those final steps. So I read an article in the Associated Press that said that the act is expected to officially become law by May or June. I'm not sure why it's so wishy-washy like that, but and it's just that after a few final formalities, including a blessing from the EU member countries. And I also remember reading somewhere or something from the conference that I attended that there was some other formal process to register it in some, I don't know, official book or something that it becomes official once it's in that book. And, I guess other countries will have signed off on it or something. But like that official sign off must not be all that comprehensive because you're talking between March and June. It's not as if you're waiting for parliaments in each country to get together and do that, because that would seem to take months or years to happen. So, but
Yeah.
anyway, but it's there. It has been approved and ready to go.
It sounds like they really do their due diligence with crossing their T's and dotting their I's. I almost said that backwards. But I want to say it sounds like it's happening pretty soon regardless. Do we expect it to be fully in play and see AI regulated by the summer? Is that egregious?
It is. It's so there's a whole long timeline of how it's going to come into force. So once that final gets written into the book thing, I think the law officially is enacted 20 days after that. But then there's a fairly long runway that happens after that of different parts of the law coming into force in different points along the way. So it's not like there's a huge like big moment. Like I think March 3rd this year was a DMA day.
A
Although
nice
that
little
came
catchy name
after,
too.
I know, right? But even that came after a pretty long runway for it. So yes, this thing is going to come into force in May or June or July. But it's not going to be a huge monumental thing right away. There's a fairly long runway for things to happen after that.
Right. It reminds me of GDPR, where there were mumblings of it, following the data protection directive for quite a long time, but only until 2016 was there really a true to form draft that we ended up passing, or I'm not near it, but you know what I mean. We saw
Right.
the
That
outcome of
happened.
in May of 2018. Yeah, so
Mhm.
it gives, I guess, industry time to prepare for those 2-year periods when, again, this is resemblant of DMA and DSA as well, where it's this warning, waiting, figure out all your ducks and where to put them kind of thing in between. Given that it's not a small undertaking to respond to some of these new mandates within these regulations.
Yeah, and I mean, clearly there's a lot of work to do for the companies, like the bigger companies that are, building large AI models and stuff like that. So yeah, but to get into kind of the crux of it, the purpose of the law itself, there was one of the presenters at the conference had a fairly interesting slide that I actually wrote it down word for word from the deck, and it said that the AI Act was to improve the functioning. Sorry, I'm going to read from the slide deck right now. I
Yeah,
know that's a
let's hear
terrible thing to do on a podcast, but
it.
it said the AI Act was to improve the functioning of the internal market and promoting the uptake of human-centric and trustworthy artificial intelligence, while ensuring a high level of protection of health, safety, fundamental rights enshrined in the Charter, including democracy, rule of law, and environmental protection against harmful effects of artificial intelligence systems in the Union, and supporting innovation.
Well, that was a mouthful. So if you need to take a drink of water, I think we're
I'm
fine
okay.
to have you do so. But do you want to break that down a little bit in like, normal non-lawyer people terms?
Yeah, I mean, so the essence that I got having read that a few times and from some of the other conversations listening to them, there's really four key parts of it that I got out of it. One was that they do want to improve internal markets. And, one of the key things that I understand from that is that they're looking at protecting intellectual property. So there's a lot of copyright. There's a lot of discussion about copyright protection and intellectual property protections in the world of AI. We've all heard that. Like
I think we've
they're
even talked about it before. We're
we have.
wondering what does it mean to really own your creative product anymore?
Yeah, exactly. And if all of that stuff, like you've published a book and now your book is being, pulled into as a learning tool for these models. So that seems to be part of it, although not sure how they're going to go about that.
It'll
But
be
so that's
tricky.
one. The second part was supporting innovation, which I actually like that. I think it's important for us to move forward as a society with technology and just do it in a responsible way. The third one is to promote the uptake of AI. So they're not against AI, but they just want to make sure it's done responsibly. And the fourth part, and this is the key thing about the EU, I think, is protecting people, or they usually refer to them as natural humans, right? In GDPR language. So protecting people and specifically democracy and the environment from harmful effects of AI, which are all good things, I
Yeah,
think.
I think they all ring true and resemble a lot of the principles outlined in GDPR as well, which we've had Gonzalo also tell us the same thing, which is, hey, when you're looking at AI systems and considering privacy for it, it doesn't change from it being AI or not. The same fundamental concepts are in place,
Right.
especially that bit about innovation, right? Like we want to share information in order to support the development of new technologies, and sometimes that requires cross-border data transfers, and the GDPR gives mechanisms to do that in a
Yeah.
safe and adequate way.
Yeah.
So how does the AI Act go about, supporting all of the elements that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so like overall, it intends to regulate how artificial intelligence is developed and used in the European Union. But they very specifically take what they call a risk-based approach, and that the regulation there's greater levels of control over use cases that have a higher level of risk. So yeah, it's kind of I guess in some ways a tiered process.
Yeah, proportionate almost. But what risk are we actually talking about? A risk to what?
Yeah, so I actually thought quite a bit about that, and a lot of the discussions they said, and even in that longer thing that I read, they talked about the charter itself, and so a lot of it goes back to the foundational stuff in the European Union and going back to a charter of fundamental rights that was created, um, and a lot of the fundamental rights and freedoms are cited in other laws, and they talk about that of protecting the fundamental rights and freedoms of natural humans in the Union. So basically, the Act intends to protect the fundamental rights and freedoms of people in the European Union. So when you're talking about risks to who, it's to the people themselves. And protecting their rights and freedoms as they're listed in the charter. But the focus isn't on protecting companies or entities, it's the people who live in the European Union themselves.
Right. So what use cases have they considered high risk when it comes to AI?
Yeah, so there's multiple tiers to it. The very highest tier is called the unacceptable risk tier. And they actually don't say a whole lot about it because there's not much to say. You can't. They just say for certain use
Don't do
cases,
it.
you just simply can't do it. So these are AI systems that are considered so high risk that they're just simply prohibited and can't be used. I read, just to get more details about that, I read a press release from the European Parliament which listed a number of things that would be outright banned. So there's a list of 6 things in here, I think. So one of them is categorization systems that are based on sensitive characteristics is one. One is untargeted scraping of facial images from the internet or CCTV footage to create facial recognition databases. The third one is emotional recognition in the workplace and in schools. The next one is social scoring. I was actually thinking about an episode from Black Mirror that was about
Yeah,
social
I
scoring. I don't know if you've ever watched that show.
I was thinking about that earlier in this talk too.
The next one is predictive policing. One is based solely on profiling, parsing, or assessing the characteristics. And I think we talked about there was a movie, Minority Report,
Mhm.
that was about that, predicting people who would commit crimes, right?
Yeah.
So that's prohibited. And the last one is AI systems that manipulates human behavior or exploits people's vulnerabilities are prohibited, which I've got to say, I agree with prohibiting all of those things.
I do too. A couple of points that stick out to me. So a lot, just generally hearing those bullets, a lot of them sound very much rooted in, of course, anti-discrimination principles, but also
Sure.
trying to avoid giving undue power and influence over those that, again, aren't expecting it, that don't have the agency to intervene and interact. And I think a lot of those situations call out that power imbalance sometimes when you're talking about, being surveilled. I mean, you're in a workplace, you're in
Right.
schools, you're out and about being a free citizen. And I think you expect to have that transparency and that notice to you when certain technologies are being used. Now, these are, of course, the unacceptable risks. So it doesn't apply here, but I'm so glad that they are unacceptable risk for that reason, because of the situational impacts I think that could happen had we use AI to make decisions in this way.
Mhm.
Something else that
Yeah.
sticks out though is that this predictive policing, which I know, I referenced my Minority Report's pretty obvious. But I also recall a lot of exceptions sometimes for data exchange, data sharing, being permitted for the use of, investigations into, national security threats. So I wonder how, and I'm not suggesting that this is something ever being considered by nation states, but I do wonder where that'll evolve, say, in the 20-year timeframe when AI is actually very powerful and the benefits in certain situations start to seem like they override the rights and freedoms of individuals, right? A good reason to have people like us talking about these risks and whatnot. But I do hope that this principle stands the test of time.
Yeah, agreed. And although, I think it would be unreasonable to think that they're going to knock this out of the park on the first one. So, I suspect that there's going to be other iterations that they'll realize, okay, we were missing some pieces or we were too strong in one area versus another. Because AI, like we've talked about, is growing so rapidly right now. It's hard to predict where it's gonna end up and how it needs to be regulated. But this certainly is a good first stab at it.
Yeah. And one last comment I'll make with that list of bullets. I mean, there's a lot of there are a lot of claims out there and a lot of opinions that social media and a lot of internet tools in general that connect people to ideas, concepts, shopping, other people, you name it, are an
Mhm.
example of manipulating human behavior. I mean, one could
Yeah.
argue that marketing, especially the digital marketing space, is a form of manipulation that you are leading people to buy things perhaps they wouldn't otherwise buy if they weren't so primed. So I wonder how that last bullet, the piece about AI manipulating human behavior, exploiting people's vulnerabilities, being forbidden. I wonder how that's going to be argued from advocates or those that are intimately involved in this draft legislation.
Yeah, it's a very broad bullet. And even like that other blurb that I quoted earlier on talked about protecting democracy.
Mhm.
And that's certainly one of those things that people are being manipulated in how they feel when it comes to, voting or who to like or what position to fall on a particular topic. So yeah, that one's pretty broad, and I don't know how they're going to get in and define exactly what types of systems, because yeah, advertising is a way of manipulating human behavior. You're causing somebody to buy something that they otherwise wouldn't have.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
let's move on. I'm interested to hear about the next category, because those were unacceptable risks. You mentioned that that was a pretty sparse one. I
Yeah.
imagine there's another that goes into more detail.
Yeah, there's a few more. So the next category is just high risk. So it's not unacceptable, but it's high.
Uncharacterized, yes.
Right. So these are systems that pose a high risk of harm to the health and safety or the fundamental rights of persons. And specifically, it says taking into account both the severity of the possible harm and the probability of occurrence. And as you know, risk professionals in some way, that's how risk is measured.
Absolutely.
What is the probability of something happening, and what's the severity or what's the impact of it when it does happen?
Yeah,
So
what are some examples of that, if you've seen?
I don't know. We didn't get into the only ones that we talked about specifics were the, you know, the do not do ones.
Mhm.
And I think this is going to become clearer over time. There's going to have to be kind of a burn-in period for this law. But one of the things that we've talked about in the past is automated decision making. So there's some really good opportunities for AI to be involved in things like screening candidates
Mhm.
for job openings, or for reviewing applicants for like life insurance or something like that. And you know, those are things that AI would absolutely be able to do and probably do it really well. But you know, in those use cases, the stakes are really high because the
Huge
outcome is that you
implications.
either, right, you're going to get the job or you're not going to get the job. Or you know, you might be denied access to life insurance or something like that. And do we want those high use case things just turned over to an AI system without there being controls over it?
Right.
So I think it is reasonable to say yes, a well-trained model that's properly governed, it's okay for it to be involved in those important things. But that's the point. It needs to be well governed and controlled and managed. And you know, at the end of the day, there needs to be a human behind the curtain who's kind of controlling it, not just turning it over.
Right. Correcting
Um,
for things like missing data, bad data, right? Unfair, implications if they are trained, because, AI can be supervised or unsupervised. And
yeah,
I really hope that there's some good guardrails there for it.
right. So so we'll see. I'm interested to see how that one evolves of what are the actual use cases for high risk systems. And it might be embedded in the law, but I don't understand the whole thing. And really we need to let it play out and see what
Yeah,
happens.
see some precedents for sure.
Yeah.
So we have two categories now. How many other categories are there?
So there's a couple of other ones. Another interesting one is AI systems with specific transparency obligations. These are systems that don't necessarily have a high risk, but that should offer some sort of transparency.
So I imagine it's for content that we might not recognize as AI, even if there's a low implication to not recognizing it as such. I'm kind of spitballing here.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. So they want to make sure that when people are interacting with AI systems, that they're aware that they are. So you know, and some of them are really, really good, and they sound like human people that you're talking to on the phone. So the point of the law is that if you're a human and you're interacting with an AI system, you should be aware that it's an AI system that you're talking to. That's going to be interesting to see how that evolves and how it's interpreted by the courts and stuff like that. But I appreciate that, because I think the crux of it is that AI systems can't just pretend to be humans and
Mhm.
then operate.
Yeah, that reminds me of that one. I know he, was aware of this, right? I think that movie Her from about 10-ish years ago. Did you ever see that one?
I'm not sure if I'm familiar with that one.
I won't spend too much time on it, but it involves AI significant others, which I think is, such an interesting concept for the time.
Sure.
But so we have now three categories on the board. How many others do you have?
Yeah, I mean, it got a little bit confusing because it almost seemed as if some of the categories were nested within one another.
Oh yeah.
But some of the ones to point out, there was a category that was simply called minimal risk. There wasn't a whole lot in there to explain it, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory itself. The other one that was interesting is a category that's called general purpose AI systems with systematic risk. And what's interesting about that category is it's the way the category is defined isn't about what it produces or anything, but it's defined by the computing power that's used to train the model as measured in flops greater than 10 to the 25th power. How about that?
How about that in English? Well, it's a crap ton of data, it sounds like.
Well, I will admit I had to go to Google to look that up. But flops stands for floating point operations per second, and it's the unit of measurement that calculates the performance capability of a supercomputer. Okay, so essentially what they're saying is they're defining this particular category as really, really powerful computers. So you fall into this category if you're using a supercomputer that is this powerful, using that unit of measurement. And I did found another article. I forget where it's from, but I'll make sure it's in the reference materials. But it estimated that a system that uses that amount of power would cost around about $10.4 million.
Okay, so I can't go out and be subject to the EU AI Act tomorrow unless I had $10 million to spend on a giant machine that served probably hundreds of thousands of people at least. I'm not, again, I'm not a core computer scientist by trade, but that sounds like enterprise level. You are, and I guess that talking about that out loud, it does make sense to include as a broad bucket category, even if it does, its harms nest in between these other categories, right? Because you want to put extra restrictions on, systems that kind of have an unfair advantage of existing because, one entity invested in doing a specific purpose with that, that AI system. And just because you can doesn't mean you should, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, so basically they're saying it's a really large system. And I was actually talking to somebody in a social event after one of the days of the conference. And I guess that like this was a unit of measure that was used in the EU. And the White House came up with a different unit of measure for the same kind of a thing, but they chose 10 to the 26th power. So we're going to go one higher.
Talk about nitpicking.
But either way, you're talking about just really powerful system.
Yeah. So everything I imagine has exclusions, right? And derogations and everything. What are the exclusions for the EU AI Act?
Yeah, so I think some of these are interesting. So some of the exclusions include systems that are used for national security, and I think you kind of alluded to that in something you were saying before.
I was waiting. Yep.
Systems that are used for military and national defense. System used by the public authority in a third country for law enforcement and judicial cooperation. So I thought that was interesting about pulling in third countries as part of it. Systems with the sole purpose of scientific research and development. And I do appreciate that because that's important. For research, testing, and development of systems up until their go-to-market point, which I'm not sure that I fully agree with that. Like you can develop something and not be subjected to the law up until the point that I'm ready to start selling it. But it seems like your development processes should be controlled also in some ways.
I wonder if that's in a sense to support at least not the adoption, but the familiarity of a particular, I'll call it AI invention. Say it's under wraps being worked on and there's some, obviously copyright issues to exposing that too early. And maybe once it passes the barrier of being, hey, I'm absolutely subject to this regulation now, doesn't, mean you just go out and ship it without adhering to these requirements, but it does give you a little point in time to make sure that happens without sacrificing your ability to gain market share.
Yeah, good point. And I guess like if the whole point is to protect the natural humans in Europe, those people are not at risk if the system isn't on the market yet.
Yeah, so, not trained by real humans.
Yeah, exactly. The last two categories of exceptions are systems that are for personal use only and not for use in a professional setting. And the last one I think is interesting. It's systems that are free and open source that use free and open sources or are free and open sources, as long as they're not prohibited or high risk systems. So, so there's a bit of a carve out there, as a salute to open source, which I think is good.
Yeah, I mean, there's more exposure of the potential vulnerabilities, right? Because we can all see under the hood in theory.
Yeah.
But what does this all mean to, say, existing AI companies? Do they have to go back to the drawing board? Like, they have to talk to some people? What happens?
Yeah, some of that wasn't fully clear. I mean, some of some of it's pretty easy that if you're operating a prohibited system, you can't. So 6 months after this thing goes into force, you have to stop doing those things, or certainly stop doing them in Europe or in any way that's going to affect residents in Europe. So even if you're operating the system here, if people in Europe are using it, it's still prohibited. So
Right. Like GDPR in
so
that way.
so there is kind of a global reach for that. But overall, it seems like there's going to have to be a process of going through assessments that you're, for a high risk system, you're assessing the risk for it and making sure that there's the right controls in place. There were some opportunities for self-assistance for lower risk. Like, it was a little bit confusing about some of the thresholds for that, but in some cases, you'll be able to do a self-assessment and submit that to the regulating board. In other cases, for like higher risk systems and that meet other certain criteria, they're going to be required to have third-party assessments performed.
Right. So kind of like that self-regulation at the bottom of the pyramid, then you work up as it's commensurate with your risk of processing.
Yeah, it wasn't quite that cut and dry. Like, I looked at a flow chart that said, like, if this, then over here, and kind of had to ask a different question. But overall, I think just to overgeneralize, if it's the higher the risk system, yes, the more likely you are to have a third party assessment done, which is probably good for us as an industry, because there's going to be a whole bunch of other people that are going to have to do these assessments. So.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess in that sense, are there any standards or frameworks that people are using or relying on today?
So not yet. The law itself had a section that talks about what they called harmonized standards. But these standards don't exist yet. And based on one of the conversations in one of the sessions with, like, I think it was a panel group, they were saying that the law itself creates the request for the harmonized standards to be created, but the law doesn't exist yet. So we got a chicken and egg problem here. So we need to wait for the law to come out before the standards organization, which I think in this case is CEN, which is the Comité Européen de Normalisation. Do you like my French accent there?
Yeah, that was that was great.
So there's this standards organization that once the law comes into force, they will create the standards. My understanding from some of the conversations that they had is that this law is expected, and this organization is already starting to develop the standards. So
yeah, it's an open secret of sorts.
Yeah, right. So they're on it.
Awesome. Well, once we do have some rules or a framework to follow, who's going to be responsible for enforcement?
That also wasn't as clear as I think it should have been. So it does sound like that they're going to follow the same GDPR process that uses, like, distributed data protection commissions and like a data protection commissioner in each of the countries.
Right. The lead authority and all that good dance.
Exactly. So each of the member countries is going to have a regulator. And these, for the GDPR, the DPCs are responsible for enforcing GDPR in each respective country. It looks like they're going to follow a similar model to that.
Interesting. So what are, I guess, a question for businesses? What's the bottom line here? What's the penalty for non-compliance?
So it's also a tiered process. So there's 2 tiers for penalties. The highest tier is 7% of global revenue for prohibited uses of AI. And the other tier is 3% of global revenue also for other infractions. One of the panel discussions at the conference included those regulators from the EU itself and from, I think, Italy and France, different regulators. And they kind of said that they expected most of the fines are going to be at the 3% level. But even that, like 3% of global revenue, that can be a substantial fine. Like, if somebody were to fine me 3% of my total earnings from last year,
I mean, these are probably,
I wouldn't be happy.
Yeah, companies that make hand over fist type profit. And I don't know, I did hear it though, and I thought, so almost sounds a little low, but maybe that's just the cynic in me. knowing it'll be nudged down. Um,
Well,
so, I mean, a question for me being, I mean, this will affect me regardless of not being a EU resident, because these will cover companies that do service EU residents. But what do we have right now in the US, and how perhaps these developments influence that?
so what? Well, this will affect the whole world, like, and even in places where it doesn't have a direct implication, I guess. One of the speakers, and I wish I could say what company she was from, but I don't want to remember it incorrectly, so I'm not going to say it. But she said that her company, it was a large tech company, their intention was to implement new procedures for this act globally for their company. And one of the points that she made was that um, if you didn't do that, you would have to put extra effort into identifying who among your customers are in the EU. And if you're going through that extra effort to determine who they are and where they are, you're actually collecting more information about those people, which is contrary to the overall intent of GDPR, which has global reach already. So her point was, we could violate people's privacy to identify who's in the EU, or we could just apply these practices globally. I think part of her point was that we can expect that there's going to be more regulations similar to this that are going to come in the
Yeah,
future.
it never
Um,
stops at just one, right? There's a constant evolution, and yeah, I like that. I kind of like that cost benefit analysis she did there, because everyone wins in that way.
yeah, and she actually quoted or cited another company and said they're going to do it also. So maybe that's going to become a standard practice. But overall, in the United States, we're not ignoring it. So in October, there was a White House executive order. It was titled the Executive Order on the Safe, Secure, and Trustworthy Development and Use of Artificial Intelligence. Um, I read an article from the Associated Press about that's, and this is a quote from that said the order is an initial step that is meant to ensure that AI is trustworthy and helpful rather than deceptive and destructive. And it predicted that the executive order, will likely need to be augmented by congressional action. So they're at least the White House is trying. It seems like it's harder and harder to have congressional action happen anymore. But anyway, their intent is to steer how AI is developed so the companies can profit. This is another quote from the article, can profit without putting public safety in jeopardy. So the intent is there to try and protect people, in this case, in our country instead of in Europe, which
Yeah,
is
it's
thumbs
great
up
to
for
hear we're
me.
taking initiative. Again, we'll track it, maybe do an episode here and there once it fully materializes. But
Yeah.
I'm happy to know that there's a lot of influence coming out of the EU consistently, even across not purely just privacy, but AI systems as well.
Yeah,
Um,
agreed.
my cat, if you're on YouTube, is kind of saying, "Hey, you've been talking there at that thing for a while." So I'm going to wrap up the episode by saying thank you for tuning in, and you can find all the links to the articles and whatnot in the description of our episodes here on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, you name it. But don't forget to check out our LinkedIn page, where you can keep up to date on our latest episode releases. Thank you, John. This was a great and very informative conversation.
Thanks, Archie. Yeah, thanks for chatting with me. I enjoyed it, and yeah, stay tuned for the next one.